Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. And this is going to be a Saturday investigation special, y'all. And you know what's interesting? I know some people may ask, Pav, why do you feel it necessary to go through every single wound on the victims and break it down? Because I will be bringing you some very detailed breakdowns of the wounds of these victims. And the reason that I'm doing that is because, for example, I think it was Law and Crime last night, where you've got Anjanette Levy, who obviously in her mind, you can tell by the way she talks that she is absolutely not buying the narrative anymore, even though she has to toe the line because of all the bad reporting she's done. But she has Joseph Scott Morgan on there. And what do? We get the actual autopsy results revealed. The actual autopsies. And Joseph Scott Morgan, that's what he's done for years. So you would expect him to actually go through there and read those things and come to some very shocking conclusions. And I can tell by the goofy look on his face, he's done that. But what do they cover? They cover the final conclusions that had already been released of the autopsies and the pathologist, and then they try to explain everything away. Well, they can explain everything away all they want. They can go to those conclusions, but I know that the pathologist was taking a K-bar knife by the investigators. We have the documents months after the crime, showed it to them. They looked at it with their eyes and said, yeah, this could be consistent with the wounds, which is so scientifically inept, it's unreal. So when people look at the conclusions of these autopsies, I think you're going to see something different than when you look at what the pathologist actually said during the autopsies. That's what I'm going to focus in on this video. Going through each and every wound, one by one, it tells us definitively important what it is we're looking at. The determination of the pathologist, the conclusions of the pathologist was obviously Veena Singh, obviously tailored weapons that created, I believe, was directed by law and what was consistent with what the detailed work they did. I believe it's her individual determination in this one that leads us closer to the truth in her final determination. And then we're going to dive into a little investigation. Considering that I've showed you how these reports are going to bring this case all together. To her, ready? Hold on. Way after the autopsy showed her an actual K-bar knife and asked her if it was consistent. She looked at it with her own eyes and said, yeah, it's consistent, which is so scientifically inept, I can't even imagine. But here's what I know, because I've gone through all the wounds on Ethan down to the fine details, and now I'm through most of the wounds on Xana. And I'm focusing in on those because I've already been able to determine that there are two different weapons, and it's very easy to determine that. And the first thing I want to show is this right here, because it's actually going to show two different weapons actually stab Xana close to each other in two different manners. Okay, so this is two different likely people attacking Xana, or one person with two different weapons in their hand attacking Xana in proximity of wounds. And here's how we know that. Because when we go to specifically with the stab wounds are the ones that's going to give you the determination of the orientation based on the clocks. So linear stab wound oriented from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So you just picture a clock, drawing it from 12 to 6, and that gives you the orientation of the wound. And then it goes on to tell you the 12 o'clock end is squared, the 6 o'clock end is sharp. So we know we've got a wound here in the medial upper left chest, even though I actually have this is the upper left chest. Okay, so medial upper left chest, it's oriented from 12 to 6. The 12 end is squared, the 6 end is sharp, showing you exactly how this wound happened. And then it'll tell you that the wound track travels from front to back, meaning it was inserted in the front and pushed in towards the back. But it also tells you that it happened from right to left, slightly downward. And that tells you everything you need to know about this strike. This strike was committed by a perpetrator holding a knife in this manner with the blade pointed down in their right hand, creating this strike and doing it with force because they had a depth of this strike of up to 6 inches. This is one of the fatal strikes. I will note that the approximate size of the knife is 3/4 inches by 3/16 of an inch. A K-bar blade is 1.188. So quite a bit wider than 3/4 of an inch in this diameter. Now they will say that elasticity could come into play with that, which, they could be right, I guess. But the overall manner in which this strike was done and the depth of the strike being 6 inches, I will note that it says the medial edge of the wound shows a dark brown abrasion, but it doesn't show a shape. This is very important because anytime that this knife or any of these knives are inserted into the victim deep enough to hit the guard of the knife, they always show either a diamond, a rectangle, or a square abrasion at the square end of the wound, denoting the actual guard of the knife is leading a mark. Since this one does not show that, it tells you that the blade that caused this wound, being 6 inches deep, is a blade that's over 6 inches. So this is at least a 7-inch or 6.5-inch blade on a knife. Could it be consistent with a K-bar? Maybe, but it's definitely consistent with a blade as long as the blade on a K-bar. But then when you get to the very next wound, this wound is created by holding a knife in this manner, stabbing from front to back, coming in from right to left, meaning it's a right-handed strike, and it's slightly downward, meaning the knife is held in this orientation. The very next wound on the upper chest to the right, on the medial upper right chest, this wound shows different characteristics altogether. The blade is actually 1/2 by 1/4 inch. The last one that we measured this strike was 3/4 inches wide by 3/16 of an inch. So when you think about elasticity, well, you've got two different blows right there near each other with totally different dimensions. It's a different wound, and I'll prove it here in just a second. Because this particular wound is oriented from 9 to 3. So in this manner, the 9 end is squared. So this end is the square, and the 3 o'clock end is sharp. So you can see the dimensions of the wound: square, sharp, in this orientation. And then it's from front to back, meaning she was stabbed in the front, but then it says from right to left and slightly upward. That means that this wound was created by somebody holding a knife in their right hand, slightly upward. So that means the orientation of the blade has to be this orientation, unlike the other wound where the blade is this orientation. Now you could say they just changed the orientation of the blade and they changed the way that they stabbed. They stabbed upward in this motion. However, you've got two different size blades, and the biggest piece of evidence you can possibly imagine: the 9 o'clock end is squared and shows a square 1/16 by 3/16 inch yellow abrasion. This is only apparent in some of the wounds. Some show a square, some show a triangle. And what it is the guard on the knife that's being used. That means that the blade of this knife, since it has the square yellow abrasion at the 9 o'clock end of the knife, that means that the blade went all the way in to where it hit the guard. This knife depth went to approximately 4 inches. So this is a 4-inch blade creating this strike right next to the knife that was creating this strike. So when you think of somebody with the orientation of at least a 6.5-inch blade stabbing downward on this angle to the chest, the very next blow they measure is on the other side of the chest, and it's a knife with a different orientation stabbing upward, and it shows a square abrasion at the end denoting a guard of the blade, and it's only a 4-inch deep wound that tells you this knife was only 4 inches, and it's pretty much irrefutable. The other thing it tells you, though, is the superior wound edge is somewhat irregular. It says this over and over and over. Well, here's what that means, y'all. When you're looking at what I believe is 2 different knives, and I believe both of the knives actually have a serrated part of the blade here and here. One is going to be over 6 inches. The other one's going to be a 4-inch blade. Pathologists often describe wounds from suspected serrated blades as having irregular edges. So when we go through, like the 2 I just showed you, it said the edges were irregular. And we go to slices on the scalp, and it talks about an irregular wound edge laterally. What they're describing is likely a serrated part of the blade. Here's another one, curved linear stab wound. Both ends are rounded. The wound edges are somewhat irregular. Well, whenever it says the wound edges are rounded, it's likely the blade twisting. But the fact that they still denote that the blade edges are somewhat irregular still indicates it's likely serrated. On the lateral right abdomen, the wound edges are irregular. And this is another twisted stab because it shows rounded edges. But again, the wound edges are irregular, denoting likely serrated blade. Then you see above the right elbow, linear incised wound with somewhat irregular edges. Again, denoting likely a serrated blade. Curved linear incised wound with irregular edges. Irregular edges. This is an inferior aspect of the right elbow. Again, denoting likely a serrated blade. Now, they can make an argument. Irregular edges can sometimes be explained by defects in the blade caused by hitting bone or other hard materials during an attack. Meaning maybe the blade got little nicks or chips in it, and that's why they're seeing irregular edges. And that's one thing that the pathologist in this case tried to claim. However, whenever they're specifically discussing serrated blades, they don't point to irregular edges. Irregular edges indicate a possible serrated blade, but they know it's a serrated blade when they start using these terms, such as striated or discontinuous abrasions, repeated small parallel marks or fine serration patterns along the edges. Remember these 2 terms. And then when we get into wounds like this on Xana's shoulder, they describe the wound edges show discontinuous 1/16 inch tan abrasions, more prominent at the inferior edge. Discontinuous tan abrasion. That is a telltale sign that they are describing a serrated edge blade. But even more so there's no doubt, when they describe scalloped or notched margins, then it is absolutely a serrated blade that caused the damage. When we look at this particular wound on Xana's chin, they specifically describe it as the lateral end is angled and shows scalloped wound edges. What they mean by scalloped wound edges is if you picture a scallop shell, and how the scallop shell goes in the manner that it goes, with the ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. That is no doubt them describing a serrated edge on a blade. Don't let anybody fool you. A lot of the marks created from the cuts on these victims came from a serrated blade knife. We now know one is over 6 inches and one is likely 4 inches. And that tells me a whole lot in this case, and I'll tell you why now. Because with a blade that's over 6 inches, it could be a K-bar, but that means it's a K-bar model that has serrades on the blade. It's not talking about the big serrades on the back like a lot of people think. Those are not what created the serrated parts of these wounds, because it's always on the cut side that they're talking about. So that means there would be serrades right here on a specific K-bar knife that is 7 inches, which I'm sure is one of the reasons they don't want to show us the knife that they claim that Koberger bought, because I'm willing to bet you it's like the one I ordered that doesn't have serrated edges. But there is one that does, that probably fits that knife sheath. But the other blade, no doubt, has serrated edges. It's a 4-inch blade, and I think it's pretty likely to be a K-bar as well, just a different type. Probably a TDI tactical that's worn by, you guessed it, law enforcement.
The law enforcement tends to go for around 55 US dollars, a smaller investigator more like 50, and the bigger ones tend to go for like 60. And they do come in different variations. You can get the large one in the drop point configuration, and you can get them all either in plain edge or serrated.
Called narco corruption, people, and it's why these kids keep winding up dead in Moscow and police have zero explanation for any of it. On that note, let's look at what the Aryan family / Omerta drug trafficking organization was up to during this time. On the very same day that Kaylee posted that TikTok, members of the Gill cell, including Bryson Gill, Michael Slocum, Isaac Cervantes, and Michael Warren, left their stash house in Shelton and made their way towards eastern Washington. We know this because the DEA had been tracking their phones for the last month. The 4 subjects were traveling together on their way to stock up in Phoenix, Arizona. Interestingly enough, they took the long way, making a stop in Boise, Idaho on October 19th. Boise, Idaho is a rather interesting location in this case, and it happens to be a drug trafficking hotspot where the Idaho gang, the Aryan Knights, are primarily located. I have to wonder if these importers from Tacoma met with their Idaho distributors, putting them on alert that the feds were on their tail. We know that Gill & Co. at a minimum had connections with Nicholas Mauitch, as they were captured on video attending his funeral in Lewiston on December 3rd, 2022. If Gill & Co. did not know that the feds were actively tracking them, then they at least had to have been put on alert, as the DEA had already made a mass indictment in the SeaTac area the month prior on September 19th.
November 15th, 2022, Lewiston, Idaho. 39-year-old Nicholas Mauitch is found wandering the streets of Lewiston. He's in rough shape, partly clothed and suffering severe cuts and abrasions to his arms and torso. He was taken to the local hospital and later life-flighted to Spokane, where he passed away from his injuries 4 days later on November 19th, 2022. Who was this man, and how did he end up in such a state that would later prove fatal? And more importantly, why did investigators who were on a nationwide manhunt for a dangerous knife-wielding suspect in the wake of the historical quadruple homicide just 30 miles north of where Mauitch was found seem to do everything in their power to avoid investigating this potential lead? Nicholas Mauitch was born and raised in Hoke Examiner in conjunction with the murder. November 15th, when he was found with fatal cuts to his upper extremities and torso. A vehicle registered in his name was found abandoned in a field, and there were no reports or signs of a collision. Mauitch was found wandering the streets in Lewiston, presumably in fear of seeking medical attention for his injuries due to the highly publicized search for the Moscow Slayer. Surely he couldn't show up to any medical facility in such a condition without raising reasonable suspicion amongst medical staff. And that's exactly what happened. On November 21st, 2022, an autopsy was conducted on Nicholas Mauitch, just 5 days after the 4 young victims were autopsied in the same office by the same physician, Spokane County's chief medical examiner, Dr. Veena D. Singh. Surely the esteemed forensic pathologist would have recognized the significance of the decedent's injuries as it pertained to the violent stabbing deaths of the 4 mutilated college students she examined just a few days earlier. On this same day, in fact, an anonymous medical staff member called the FBI and reported the incident in conjunction with the murder investigation.
And to think about, look into possibly if you want to. This one comes from, again, this TikTok. Do you think this looks like the same guy? Now, this was somebody that was at the grub truck. I remember seeing it, but I can't tell if it is or if it's not. I don't think he looks the same. That's my opinion. The people he attacked may have injured him, is what I believe, if I remember correctly, what I heard from it. So, it's very interesting. All I'm saying is that for those of you that are like, oh, Bob is ridiculous, he's wrong, he's this, he's that, don't go there yet, okay? In my opinion.
There's only one person I know that works harder, if not just as hard as Lana.
I've said that, Pavarotti. Him and Lana are the two that work the hardest out here, in my opinion.
Now that we know what they've been trying to hide from us the entire time, with the marks left on the victims that clearly describe who they want to take credit for this atrocity, it brings me back to this. What we have is a suspect that they identified on November 21st. They had his DNA by the 23rd. It just happens to be the exact same time that they focused in on the man in black walking towards the King Road residence seen on the Queen Road footage. So I really start thinking about things around this situation now. And don't let me even bring up the fact that I'm looking at a Hudson's contracting hat here on this gentleman. And one of the things that Hudson Contracting does is excavation and concrete work in Moscow, Idaho. And I can't help but think that it's possible that they have subcontracted Germer Construction, maybe for that excavation and contracting work before, which would put him in direct contact with Tyson Farley. But then I think about this. On November 13th, we know in Moscow is the atrocity. When law enforcement focused in on Brian Kohberger, on November 13th, they say his phone pinged near Genesee, Idaho. Now, we know that likely that phone ping really happened over here on his way back from Mauitch Park, but it doesn't change the fact that they really wanted to put Kohberger in Genesee for some reason after this crime. And then we know that less than 2 days later, they find Mauitch down here in Lewiston, and then the entire saga of Mauitch starts on November 15, 2022. What a lot of people don't know, though, is Mauitch, for some time, had an address up in Genesee, Idaho. And I find that to be interesting when you bring in why they would try to put Kohberger in Genesee. And then I think about this, after everything we've talked about with the pathologist, Dr. Veena Singh, doing the autopsy on Mauitch and the victims, knowing about the size of knife she's looking for and the serrated edges. And then I think about the 4-inch blade I've already talked about. Then it brings me back to this. And this happened on March 20th, Monday. I was notified via email of a found property call reported by the Lewiston, I guess that's LIEDAHO County or Lewiston County, wherein the reporting party discovered a K-bar brand knife in some bushes in the city of Genesee, Idaho. The knife was located by a child playing in some trees at the top of Ash Street near Spruce Street. And the knife was a K-bar brand knife with a blade approximately 4 inches in length. That knife was collected and booked into MPD evidence. So we've got a 4-inch K-bar knife found in Genesee near Ash and Spruce Streets. So atop of Ash and Spruce Streets in some trees, well, I would have to think that it's either these trees here, here, or here, probably here. Let's take a look. Now, this is probably not there. That's more in somebody's yard. I guess it could have been in these trees. It's a small little area. Or in these trees up here, but that certainly looks like somebody was driving through and would have tossed that out. I would sure like to see if they ever did any forensic examinations on that 4-inch knife, because it sure seems like it could be material. I think they messed up by releasing this information they've released to us now, because it's going to tell us so much about this investigation, the crime, when we correlate it to everything that we already know about the DNA results, all of the blood samples taken in the house, witness statements. You put everything together and it paints a picture that Picasso himself couldn't have painted, that tells us the truth of the matter. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms. Till next time, old Pavarotti's out.